Hello, friends. Today's story is called God Chooses a King for Israel. Do you remember our story from a couple of weeks ago? Remember the prophet Samuel? He always listened to God and tried to do what God wanted as he led the children of Israel. But Samuel was old, and God's children wanted a king to replace him. So, God decided to give the people what they wanted, even though he warned them that a king wasn't a good idea. But God's children remained firm. They wanted a king. This is where our story begins today. There was a man named Kish who had a son named Saul. Saul was so handsome and bright, and he was very, very tall. Kish's prized donkeys got lost one day. He told Saul to search for them. "Take my servant and find my donkeys. They could get hurt. They must be found." So Saul and the servant searched the grounds. They looked high and low, but the donkeys couldn't be found. Saul told the servant, "We'd better head home, or Father will worry. Come on." But the servant told Saul, "Hey, the prophet Samuel lives nearby. Let's visit him. He listens to God, and he will tell us what he hears. We will ask him where the donkeys can be found. Then we can bring the donkeys back home, and our trouble will be over." So they looked around for a while and saw some girls at a well. Saul asked, "Is the prophet Samuel nearby?" "Yes, he is," the girls replied. "He's in the town for the sacrifice, and all the people are waiting. They will feast, and Samuel will give them God's blessing." So Saul and his servant went to find Samuel. When they found him, Samuel recognized Saul. "Hello, Saul. I am Samuel, the priest. God told me you would come. Let's sit down and eat together. Your father's donkeys got lost, but they are already back home." You see, God had spoken to Samuel, and he knew that Saul would be king. But Samuel also knew that Saul was tired. So they sat down and ate at the feast. Tomorrow, Samuel would tell Saul that he would be king. Saul slept at Samuel's house, and when he woke up the next day, Samuel said to Saul, "Come for a walk with me. I have something to tell you." Samuel said, "God wants me to tell you that he chose you to be king of the Israelites." Now, that must have been a little shocking for Saul. In fact, he even told Samuel that he was nothing special. But God had spoken to Samuel, and he poured oil on Saul's head to anoint him with God's blessing. "You will hear God's voice, and his word you will speak. God will change your heart, and you will seek his blessings." A week later, Samuel called out all the tribes and leaders. Then Saul's tribe was called. But where was Saul? Saul was scared, and his heart was not eager to take on this new job. Then Samuel called out to the crowd, "Look who I bring. See who God has chosen to be your king. God has given you what you asked. I will tell him of his duties and responsibilities." The people were happy, and they began to sing. They shouted, "Long live the king!" So Saul was no longer scared, and his heart was eager to take on this new role. He was now ready to be Israel's leader. Here are some things to learn from this story. First, the people were happy, but Samuel knew that problems would soon come. The people were more worried about being like other nations than they were about following God. How about you? Do you always wish you were like other people? Remember that God is the best example. If we try to be the kind of person that God wants us to be, then we will always be happy. And number 2, now, when Saul meets Samuel, he actually says that there was nothing special about him. This is a great example that God can definitely use anybody for his purposes, regardless of what we may think of that person or what they might think of themselves. So never forget, God can use you too. Here is our verse for the week. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. 1 Peter 4:10.